It could have been the greatest album in rock history. In 1969, Bob Dylan secretly reached out to form a supergroup with the Beatles and Stone. George Harrison said yes. Keith Richards called it fantastic. The plan was set until Mick Jagger suddenly said no. But why did Jagger walk away from the collaboration of the century? The shocking truth remained hidden for decades. The full story is more disturbing than fans ever imagined. Mick Jagger was born on July 26, 1943, in Dartford, Kent. It was the middle of World War II. Bombs from German planes were still falling on British towns, and Dartford was no exception. His father, Basil Jagger, taught physical education. His mother, Eva, was active in local politics. At just 4 years old, Mick met another boy named Keith Richards. They sat in the same classroom at Wentworth's primary school. For a short while, they were friends, but their families moved apart, and they lost touch. It seemed like nothing special, but that short childhood connection planted a tiny seed. No one knew then that the world's biggest rock band would one day grow from that small moment. By the time Mick turned 14, he had already found his true love, American blues. While most British teens were dancing to skiffle, Jagger was digging through old mail-order catalogs for rare records. He searched for names like Howlin' Wolf, Muddy Waters, and Little Richard. He listened to Radio Luxembourg late at night, one of the few stations that played the blues. His record collection became legendary among his friends. Mick even walked miles just to borrow a new LP. He wasn't just a fan, he studied the blues. He mimicked the singing styles of his idols so well that people couldn't believe he was British. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He just wanted to feel the music in his bones, and it showed. Then came October 17th, 1961. Mick was 18 and holding few blues records while waiting for a train in Dartford. That's when Keith Richards walked up. They hadn't seen each other in years. Keith noticed the albums right away. Chuck Berry, Muddy Waters. It sparked something between them. They talked, they laughed, and they realized they shared the same fire for music. What are the odds? Two boys, both obsessed with a style of music almost no one else around them cared about, crossing paths again on an ordinary commuter train. That one moment changed everything. Within weeks, they were meeting regularly, listening to music and jamming. That train ride quietly set the Rolling Stones in motion. In 1960, before anyone had heard of the Stones, Mick and Keith started a band with their friend Dick Taylor. They called it Little Boy Blue and the Blue Boys. It wasn't just a hobby, they were serious. They played blues and R&B covers at local parties and clubs, places where most people had never even heard that kind of music. Mick stood at the front, bold and confident, already moving like a star. They recorded rough demos on old reel-to-reel tape machines. Some of those tapes still exist. Their songs came from American legends like Jimmy Reed and Bo Diddley. Jagger was just 17, but his voice already had grit. Stage presence already pulled people in. He didn't wait for fame. He was building it gig by gig, chord by chord. But even with music burning inside him, Jagger took a strange detour. In 1961, he enrolled at the London School of Economics. His goal was to study business, maybe even follow in his father's footsteps. His grades were good. His professors saw him as smart and driven. By day, he learned about finance and law. By night, he played music in smoky clubs. For a moment, it looked like he might give it all Upa's stable life, a desk job, a future in banking. But the music kept calling. In 1962, Jagger made a choice. He dropped out. He turned his back on a safe career and threw himself into rock and roll. It shocked his family. It surprised his friends. But it changed history. If he hadn't taken that risk, the Rolling Stones might have stayed in the shadows. Rolling Stones' early gigs were loud and messy, especially at the Marquee Club in London. They played songs by Muddy Waters and Chuck Berry. The band even got their name from a Muddy Waters song, Rolling Stone. Right from the start, their music clicked. But so did the drama. Brian Jones had started the band, but he soon clashed with Mick and Keith over who was really in charge. That tension never really left. By 1964, they dropped their first album, The Rolling Stones. Came out on April 16th, gritty and raw. It didn't try to be pretty. That's what made it powerful. Within weeks, it hit #1 on the UK albums chart and stayed there for 12 straight weeks. Then came the last time in February 1965. It wasn't just another song, it was there. First UK #1 single written by Jagger and Richards themselves. They sold over 250,000 copies in just the first week. With their loud guitars and bold lyrics, they didn't just sound different, they felt different. Suddenly, they weren't just a band. They were the face of a new kind of youth, angry, rebellious, and ready to push back. And then came a monster hit. In June 1965, I Can't Get No Satisfaction exploded. It became their first US #1 song and stayed at the top for 4 weeks. The riff, Keith Richards created it with a fuzz pedal and reportedly didn't even remember writing it. He recorded it half asleep. The lyrics talked about frustration, sex, and feeling used by ads and society. Some radio stations refused to play it, but the fans couldn't get enough. It sold over 1 million copies in the US in just a few months. That song changed everything. It made the Rolling Stones the wild, dangerous alternative to the clean-cut Beatles. From then on, they were rock's bad boys. But the rebellion had real consequences. On February 12, 1967, police raided Keith Richards' house during a party. Mick Jagger, Keith, and an art dealer were arrested. The charges: possession of amphetamines and cannabis. But the headlines were all about the scandal. Rumors spread that Marianne Faithfull had been found at the scene wearing nothing but a fur rug. Mick got 3 months, Keith got a year. Both spent only 1 night in Brixton prison before being released. Public outrage helped. A famous article in the Times asked, "Who breaks a butterfly on a wheel?" The bust made them legends, but it also showed how deeply the older generation feared what they represented. Then, just 2 years later, the band's darkest moment arrived. Brian Jones was gone from the band, forced out in June 1969 due to his erratic behavior and drug use. Less than a month later, on July 3rd, he was found dead at the bottom of his swimming pool in Sussex. He was only 27. The official report called it death by misadventure, but fans weren't so sure. Some blamed Mick and Keith. They said the band had betrayed him, abandoned him. Jones's death turned him into a tragic symbol. He joined the infamous 27 Club, a list that would later include Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Kurt Cobain. The timing was eerie. Just days before, the Stones had replaced Jones with Mick Taylor. The shock never really faded. Even years later, Jagger and Richards seemed haunted by what happened. On the other hand, Bob Dylan was born on May 24, 1941, in Duluth, Minnesota. But he didn't grow up in a big city. He spent his childhood in Hibbing, a small town in Minnesota's Iron Range. It was cold, quiet, and far away from everything. Just 17,000 people lived there back then. The main thing in town was a giant iron mine, the biggest open-pit iron mine in the world. His dad worked for Standard Oil, and life was simple. But the place felt cut off from the rest of the world. Dylan once said, "You could look out your window and see nothing but miles of dirt." Yet that lonely town somehow sparked his imagination. He spent hours tuning into faraway radio stations, listening to blues, country, and early rock. That isolation gave birth to a mind that refused to stay quiet. He never had music lessons, he didn't need them. Dylan taught himself to play piano and guitar by ear. He started writing poems when he was 10. Not long after, he began writing songs. The radio became his teacher. He listened to Hank Williams, Muddy Waters, and most of all, Woody Guthrie. Guthrie's music hit him like lightning. It wasn't just sound, it was purpose. Dylan said it felt like Guthrie was passing him the crown. He studied Guthrie's voice, his stories, his style, like a student trying to master every line by his teenage years. Dylan was already performing in local bands. One of them, the Golden Chords, got banned from a school talent show because they were too loud. He didn't care. He was building something slowly, quietly, obsessively. At 19, he couldn't wait anymore. In January 1961, Dylan left everything behind and hitchhiked to New York. He had a guitar and just $10 in his pocket. But he had a plan. He wanted to meet Woody Guthrie. He also knew Greenwich Village was where music was happening. The moment he arrived, everything changed. He played in smoky coffee houses, slept on couches, and soaked up the scene. The Village was full of poets, rebels, and dreamers. Dylan fit right in. He quickly got noticed. Within months, he was sharing stages with big names in the folk world. He even visited Guthrie in the hospital. It was like the world was opening its door one by one. That same year, a music executive named John Hammond came to see him perform. Hammond had signed legends like Billie Holiday, and when he saw Dylan, something clicked. He didn't care that Dylan's voice was raw or strange. He saw the fire inside. Hammond signed him to Columbia Records in 1961. Most people at the label thought it was a mistake. They called Dylan Hammond's folly, but Hammond believed. Dylan's first album came out in March 1962. It was recorded in just 2 days. Only 2 of the songs were his own. Didn't sell much, just 5,000 copies that year. Still, the way he sang old folk songs was different. It was intense, honest. It didn't need polish, it needed ears. Then something wild happened. In 1962, Dylan wrote Blowing in the Wind. The next year, Peter, Paul, and Mary released their version. It sold over 300,000 copies in just 1 week. It climbed to number 2 on the Billboard charts, another protest song. The Times They Are A-Changing came in 1963. Joan Baez helped make it famous. She sang Dylan's songs at protests and on TV. People began to realize these weren't just tunes. They were messages. They were fuel. His words echoed at the March on Washington, at anti-war rallies, and on college campuses. People everywhere were singing his song, even if they didn't know his face. He was only in his early 20s. His lyrics were shaping history. And even then, Dylan didn't want to be a hero. "I'm just a song and dance man," he once said, but his journey wasn't. Without controversies, on July 25, 1965, Bob Dylan walked on stage at the Newport Folk Festival holding an electric guitar. He was only 24 years old. This was the moment everything changed. People had come expecting Dylan's usual acoustic folk songs, but instead, they got loud electric rock. His band included members from the Paul Butterfield Blues Band and pianist Barry Goldberg. The crowd didn't know what hit them. The reaction was wild. Some fans booed, some yelled, others threw things. Folk music lovers saw it as a betrayal. Pete Seeger, a festival board member, was so upset he reportedly tried to cut the cables with an axe, though later he said it was just because the sound was too distorted. Dylan only played 3 songs, including Maggie's Farm and Like a Rolling Stone, before walking off the stage. He came back to play 2 quiet acoustic songs, and the crowd cheered. But the damage was done. Dylan didn't return to Newport for 37 years. That night became one of the most talked about moments in music history. Less than a year later, things got even more intense. On May 17, 1966, at the Free Trade Hall in Manchester, England, Dylan played the first half of his show with just an acoustic guitar. The audience listened quietly. Then, after the break, he came back with a full electric band, the Hawks. The mood changed fast. Near the end of the concert, someone in the crowd yelled, "Judas." It hit like a bomb. Dylan fired back, "I don't believe you. You're a liar." Then he turned to his band and growled, "Play it loud." They launched into a roaring version of Like a Rolling Stone. That moment, raw and defiant, was recorded and spread for years as a bootleg, now considered one of the greatest live performances ever. But just as his electric era hit full force, Dylan disappeared. On July 29, 1966, he crashed his Triumph motorcycle near Woodstock, New York. Officially, he broke several vertebrae in his neck, but there were no hospital records, no ambulance. Some people think the crash wasn't as bad as it seemed, or maybe didn't even happen. Others say Dylan used it as an excuse to step away from the pressure, the fame, and maybe even from drug problems. Whatever the truth, the result was the same Dylan vanished from the spotlight. He stopped touring. Some fans even thought he died. For the next 8 years, he stayed mostly out of the public eye. Instead of performing, Dylan began recording music at home in 1967. He and the band set up in the basement of a pink house in Woodstock. They started making music just for fun. It wasn't polished, it wasn't meant for release, but they recorded. Over 100 songs in just a few months. sometimes doing 10 or 15 in a single day. Some of those songs later became hits for other artists. The sessions were finally released in 1975 as the Basement Tapes. The songs had a different feel, less wild and electric. It's more rooted in American tradition. This was Dylan reinventing himself again. Then came another surprise. In December 1967, Dylan released John Wesley Harding. It was simple, quiet, and full of strange biblical stories. He recorded it in just 3 sessions. It reached number 2 in the United States and hit number 1 in the UK. One of its songs, All Along the Watchtower, became a rock anthem when Jimi Hendrix covered it. But Dylan wasn't done. In April 1969, he released Nashville Skyline. This time, he went full country. His voice sounded softer. The lyrics were more direct. Sang a duet with Johnny Cash on Girl from the North Country. The album reached number 3 in the United States and topped the charts in the UK in 1969. Something unbelievable almost happened in the world of rock music. Bob Dylan, out of nowhere, suggested forming a supergroup with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. This wasn't just some wild idea at a party. Dylan actually went up to producer Glyn Johns in New York and said, "I have this idea to make a record with the Beatles and the Stones. Would you find out if the others would be interested?" Johns had just worked with both bands, produced Get Back for the Beatles and Beggar's Banquet for the Stones. He knew this wasn't a joke. This was Dylan. This was real. 3 of the biggest names in music, Dylan, the Beatles, and the Stones, possibly on one album. Though the idea was insane and Johns knew he had to try, he went straight to work. The plan: take the best songs from Dylan, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Mick Jagger, and Keith Richards, then mix and match the rhythm section Ringo Starr, Charlie Watts, Bill Wyman, whoever fit the song best. It would have been the ultimate collaboration. The talent was there. The songs were ready. The timing was perfect. This wasn't just a dream, it was almost reality. When Johns talked to the musicians, the reactions were mixed, but some were surprisingly positive. Keith Richards and George Harrison didn't hesitate. They thought it was a brilliant idea. Both of them admired Dylan deeply. George had already worked closely with Dylan and would later join him in the Traveling Wilburys. Keith was excited. He called the idea fantastic. Ringo, Charlie, and Bill Wyman were open to it. They said they'd join if everyone else did. They weren't against it, they just didn't want to rock the boat alone. John Lennon was more complicated. Didn't say no, but he wasn't really into it. Maybe he didn't want to share control. Maybe he thought it was too messy to pull off. Either way, he didn't push for it. Surprising part was that the idea didn't fall apart right away. Big names like these usually came with big egos, but this time the door stayed open for a while. There was real curiosity. Dylan had changed the way the Beatles thought about lyrics. Harrison and Richards were among the most respected guitarists of their time, and somehow they were ready to work together. But then came the hard stop. Paul McCartney and Mick Jagger both said no, not maybe, not let's talk later, just no. That was the end of it. McCartney was already dealing with serious trouble inside the Beatles. He and Lennon were fighting. The band was close to breaking apart. Adding more strong personalities into that mix probably sounded like a nightmare to him. Jagger had a different reason. He was building a clear identity for the Stones. They were the rebel, the gritty, raw alternative to the polished Beatles. Mixing that image with Dylan's loose wandering style could mess everything up. He didn't want the Stones to be swallowed by Dylan's world. Looking back, even Glyn Johns admitted maybe they were right. Maybe it was too big, too hard to pull off. But fans still talk about it. Just imagine what could have come from that one album, 6 Legends. It could have changed everything. Jagger later explained his fear more clearly. It wasn't just that. He and Dylan had different styles. It was that Dylan had this wild, chaotic energy. He would come into a session with half-written songs, throw out strange directions like play it like it's raining, and expect musicians to figure it out on the spot. The Stones didn't work like that. They built songs piece by piece. Repeated takes until everything locked together. So that was their sound. That was their identity. Jagger felt that jumping into Dylan's world could ruin that. Dylan wasn't trying to dominate, he just pulled everything toward him by nature. And Jagger didn't want to lose control of his band. There's one night in 1972 that really showed the gap between them. Dylan showed up at a club in New York, where Jagger and other stars were hanging out. Dylan picked up a guitar and started playing. The room fell silent. He was deep in his own world, weird rhythm, strange lyrics, unpredictable patterns. Nobody else joined in. Jagger later said he wanted to, but it didn't feel right. The song didn't have a clear beat. No one could follow. Everyone just watched. Some thought they were witnessing genius. Others were confused. No one played along. That jam session could have been a big moment. Instead, it quietly showed that some artists, no matter how great, are just too different to work together. Dylan had his own universe. The Stones had theirs. That night ended with a quiet nod between worlds that couldn't blend. In 1971, the Rolling Stones released Sticky Fingers. It wasn't just another album. It was their first under their own label and featured that now famous tongue and lips logo. Andy Warhol designed the cover, and it had a real zipper. That little gimmick cost them $34,175 at the time, an insane amount that would be worth millions today. But the gamble paid off. The album went straight to #1 in both the United States and UK, and sold over 3 million copies in the States. Alone, it kicked off a streak of 8 straight #1 albums. Songs like Brown Sugar and Wild Horses became instant classics. By 1999, Sticky Fingers was added to the Grammy Hall of Fame. Then came 1972's Exile on Main Street. The band recorded it in a French villa while hiding from the UK taxman. The sessions were wild, full of excess and chaos, but the result was magical. Critics still call it one of the greatest rock albums of all time. These 2 records didn't just dominate charts, they defined what rock and roll sounded like in the 70s. Behind the scenes, though, things got messy. Keith Richards was deep into heroin by the mid-70s. He was arrested in Toronto, enough heroin to be charged with trafficking that could have meant life in prison. During that time, Richards would vanish during studio sessions. Mick Jagger had to take charge. He ran everything from the music to the legal issue. While Jagger kept the band alive, Richards fell further into addiction. When Keith eventually came back, he found that Jagger wasn't ready to share the spotlight anymore. That shift created tension that never really went away. By the end of 1974, another shock hit the Stones. Mick Taylor quit the band. His bluesy guitar had been a key part of their sound since Let It Bleed. But just days before a new album's recording sessions, he walked away. The timing was terrible. The band scrambled. That's when Ronnie Wood stepped in. He had played with Faces and Jeff Beck, but his style was rougher and more in sync with Keith's. Wood clicked with the band quickly. While many thought he might be a temporary fix, he's now been with the Stones for almost 50 years, longer than either Brian Jones or Mick Taylor. The cracks between Jagger and Richards finally exploded. In the mid-1980s, after releasing Dirty Work in 1986, Richards wanted to tour. Jagger didn't. He was focused on his solo career and even sent a formal letter to say no. Richards called it World War III. They barely spoke, except through harsh lyrics in their own songs. The band essentially broke up. But somehow they patched things up and returned with Steel Wheels in 1989. It was one of the few times in rock history a split this deep actually healed. While the Stones were on pause, Jagger tried going solo. His first album, She's the Boss, dropped in 1985. He had stars like Jeff Beck and Nile Rodgers backing him. It sold well, went platinum, and the song Just Another Night hit #12 on the Billboard charts. But fans and critics weren't impressed. Keith Richards even joked, everyone had a copy, but nobody listened to it. In 1987, Jagger released Primitive Cool. It barely made it into the top 40. The music was polished but forgettable. Even his tours didn't reach the United States. Richards later said Jagger's solo work was just ego and he had nothing to say. Those failures only made it clear Jagger needed the Stones, and the Stones needed him. Meanwhile, Bob Dylan was creating something entirely different. In 1974, he began recording Blood on the Tracks. Over 4 frantic days in a New York studio, he laid down most of the album. The sessions were chaotic. Dylan rushed through songs, skipped fixing mistakes, and often moved on without notice. One guitarist remembered Dylan drinking wine in the studio, doing things his own way. By day 2, he'd already replaced most of the band. Just as the album was about to launch, pressings done, artwork ready, Dylan changed his mind. At his brother's urging, he re-recorded half of it in Minnesota. He used mostly unknown musicians. Hay kept changing lyrics, keys, and arrangements right up to the final hour. Idiot Wind went through at least 9 versions. You're gonna make Me Lonesome When You Go had 12, but somehow, through all the chaos, Dylan made a masterpiece. Dylan's live shows were no less unpredictable. He often changed keys in the middle of songs, skipped verses, or mumbled his lyrics so much fans didn't know what song was playing. At one 2018 show in Pennsylvania, his piano playing was so erratic that even his band couldn't keep up. This kind of performance wasn't new, he's been doing it since the 1960s. For Dylan, the stage wasn't a place to repeat hits, it was a place to experiment. Every night was different. His unpredictability reached a new level at Live Aid in 1985. Dylan played with Keith Richards and Ronnie Wood in front of millions. It should have been a big moment. Instead, it was a mess. Their guitars were out of tune, sound issues ruined the set. Dylan even broke a string mid-song. Wood handed him his guitar, but it was barely playable. Critics called the performance awkward and painful. But Dylan made a throwaway comment that changed everything. He suggested some of the money raised should help American farmers. That idea turned into Farm Aid, a benefit concert series that still runs today. In 1988, Dylan started something no one expected, a tour that never really ended. Since June 7th of that year, he's played over 3,000 shows. He didn't tour to promote albums, he toured to keep performing. Every set list was different. Every arrangement changed. Dylan's band had to be ready for anything, you might call out a song they hadn't rehearsed in years or shift the entire sound mid-song. For over 35 years, this never-ending tour became the heart of his career. Even his bandmates had to adjust to Dylan's strange ways. He gave directions that didn't sound like musical instructions at all. Instead of saying, play faster, he might say, make it sound like it's raining, or think of the color blue. Musicians had to guess what he meant. Bassist Tony Garnier often had to decode Dylan's whispers and pass them along. This forced the band to stay sharp always, ready to adapt. Dylan didn't want perfection.